Hello and welcome. Today we're tuning in from the HL studio. I'm Claire Stinton, Head of Workplace Saving Analysis, and I'm delighted to be joined by three of my colleagues. So we have Sarah Coles, our Head of Personal Finance, Helen Morrissey, our Head of Retirement Analysis, and Bradley Clark, one of our Chartered Financial Planners. Afternoon all, thank you for joining us. So thank you very much for tuning in to our post-budget webinar, which we have titled New Year, because of course we are still in January, albeit the end of January, and new-ish rules, because it is 3 months since Labour's October budget, where they announced measures to boost tax receipts in order to plug the shortfall in public finances. So now the dust has settled, we're going to explore how those changes could impact your finances, but particularly how there is a window between now and the 5th of April, so that's the end of tax year, to really make changes to protect and safeguard your finances. So lots more on that coming up. We have an hour this afternoon, so the first 40 or so minutes will be designated for our main discussion, and then the final 15 to 20 minutes we will move to audience Q&A. So if you do have any questions, please raise those through the Q&A rather than the chat, because it just makes them much easier to answer at the end of the session. Also, I'd just like to say that we've got quite a big audience this afternoon, so we will try and get through as many questions as possible. But if you have any really individualistic or detailed questions, then they might be better taken offline, and there will be an opportunity to book a chat with one of our financial advisors towards the end of the session. So the final thing that I need to also say is that everything we discuss today will be information, not advice. And do bear in mind that what we do talk through, the principles might not equally apply to everyone. So please do bear that in mind. That's the housekeeping out of the way. So let's get started. I know that we are now in the last week of January, but typically at the start of a new year and at the close of one year and the start of another, people have a renewed focus on healthy habits and finances. In actual fact, 6 in 10 of us will make a financial resolution, according to a survey that we ran with Opinion in September last year. Brad, do you tend to find that there's a surge in client activity around this time of the year?
Yes, there's always an uptick in client contact in the first sort of 3 or 4 months of the year, and I think it really comes down to 3 things. I think the first is the one that you've mentioned, Claire, in that it's the start of a new year, and it's a great time to sort of set or reassess financial goals, and that in itself leads to clients getting in touch with us. I think another reason is that a lot of people over Christmas and New Year, they have their longest period of time off work. And actually a lot of people will stop work around the 19th or 20th of December and perhaps not be back in till early January. I think this year it was the 6th of Jan when a lot of people went back to work. And that gives you a lot of time, particularly if you're working towards retirement or thinking about it, it almost gives you a bit of a glimpse into your future. And I find that I get the majority of my retirement inquiries in this first sort of 2 or 3 months of the year. And then the third reason is that January marks sort of the unofficial beginning of the end of the tax year, or tax year end season as we call it here at HL. So we've only got 2 or 3, 4 months until the end of the tax year, and that means using allowances like ISAs, CGT allowance, pension allowances, etc. And that's another reason why people do get in touch with us.
Thank you. It's interesting about Christmas being a window into future retirement, but perhaps with a few added mince pies and lots of presents. So with you all being here as the experts, it would be remiss of me not to ask you what the one financial thing is that you would encourage people to do in 2025, or as it is trending online, 2020 Thrive. So I'll come to you first, Bradley. What's your tip?
Well, my official job title is a financial planner, and I'll be coming back to that word plan quite regularly today. So unsurprisingly, my top tip for this year is anybody who's looking at their finances, if you haven't already, build a plan, get one in place. If you do have one, then take this opportunity to review it. And I think in both cases, make sure you automate your actions as much as possible in terms of working towards that plan.
Absolutely, life is busy enough as it is, so any automation to help you build healthy, consistent habits is a win. Helen, coming to you next.
Okay, so my top tip for 2020 Thrive, I love that, is to take a look at what you've got in your pension or pensions. A lot of us have more than one pension. You might find that you get a really pleasant surprise. You might actually find that you have more saved for retirement than you thought. What I would say is once you know how much you've got in your pensions, you can then use, there's so many tools out there, online pension calculators, that'll kind of give you a sense of how much that might get you by the time you retire, and how much income that might be able to generate. And that's incredibly useful because it can give you that real sense of security, that you either know that you're on track, or it can give you the time to put a plan in place if you've still got a bit of catching up to do.
Brilliant. And Sarah?
Well, I think when you talk about 2020 Thrive, I think it's perfectly fine to be 2020 just getting by, thanks very much. And I think one of the key things for me is just to try not to be perfect overnight. So we come across this when people want to make big sort of changes to their fitness as well. So they say, oh, tomorrow I'm going to be super fit. I'm going to go to the gym 4 times a day and, run a marathon by the end of the week. And as soon as you set yourself these impossible goals, you're going to fail. Lifestyle change is really hard, and any change is difficult. So I would say, make a step, take a step forward, but don't try and be perfect overnight. Just be good enough and be better every day. That's my tip.
It's a great tip. So progress beats perfection. Fewer than 10% of people will commit and actually see that resolution through for 12 months or longer. So any tips for staying on track, Sarah?
Yeah, so the first one is to be specific. So it's not just about having a goal. So I'm going to be, more on track with my debt or whatever it is. You actually need a plan to get to that goal. Mm-hmm. So it's rather than just having a destination, it's having a map as well. And then you kind of work out what steps you need to take and then make those steps. I think definitely pay yourself first is absolutely key. So that's just any of those changes you want to make them at the start of the month. Because if you leave it to the end of the month, you're just going to spend any extra cash that you were going to use to put towards it. What you were saying earlier about automating things, just make it really easy. Just set up direct debits. It's so much easier than doing the right thing every single sort of month. And the last thing is to free up the cash. So you've really got to avoid sort of planning yourself into a kind of financial cul-de-sac. If you put money aside at the beginning of the month, you need to work out where that's going to come from. You just get slightly towards the end of the month and you're going to be left with a bit more months at the end of the money than you would ideally like.
And one thing that you could do is you can combine 2 of those. So you can automate and pay yourself first by actually building budgeting into your plan, and then you can have on payday a direct debit, move your savings out into a separate account so that it's out of sight, out of mind. It certainly works for me and prevents me from dipping into it towards the end of the month, particularly January, a very long month. So as well as new resolutions, there's also some newish rules that we've had from the autumn budget, which is very hard to believe it was just 3 months ago, because it feels like considerably longer than that, probably because there was so much speculation and buzz in the lead up to it. Sarah and Helen, I know you two were in the thick of it for months. Sarah, could you give us a bit of a quick recap on the main points?
Yep, so it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour. So I think for savers and investors, one of the biggest changes was that change to capital gains tax on stocks and shares. So for higher rate taxpayers, it meant moving from previously paying 20% tax on capital gains to 24%. And then for basic rate taxpayers, it was moving from 10% to 18%. And actually that jump up for basic rate taxpayers has caught a lot of people out, especially where couples have arranged things so that the basic rate taxpayer is going to be paying the bulk of those bills. So that came as quite a nasty surprise. Then one of the other things that happened overnight was the stamp duty surcharge on second and subsequent properties. So that went from 3% to 5%. Again, that was another horrible shock for property investors. And then something that we see every budget. So, as soon as the Chancellor sits down, it means that the price of tobacco has gone up. There was also some freezes confirmed. So on the plus side, fuel duty was frozen, which is something that everyone was speculating might not happen. Unfortunately, also ISA allowances were frozen, and that's until 2030. And the inheritance tax threshold will be also frozen until 2030, which I know we'll be talking about a bit later. There are also some changes that haven't kicked in yet. So one of the welcome ones was the confirmation that the state pension will go up by 4.1%. And we've also got some pretty chunky rises in the minimum wage. Alcohol duty is going to rise in February, so that usually happens overnight. But, top fact, Jeremy Hunt had frozen it until February. So as soon as that freeze runs out, it's going to go up. And there'll be a new vaping duty in 2026. There's also going to be, and it just doesn't stop, there's so much, but there's inheritance tax on some inherited pensions, which again, I know you're going to be talking about later from 2027. And then from 2026, there's some changes to inheritance tax. Now, those affect farmers, which we know obviously from the number of tractors that have been in London recently. It's also affecting family businesses who want to pass on assets to their family, and AIM investors, so qualifying AIM stocks that were previously free of IHT if you held them for 2 years. Now you do get 50% tax relief on them, but you will still pay an inheritance tax on them. And the estimate is that's going to affect roughly 1,000 AIM investors.
There is a lot there, isn't there? Were there any small wins within all of that?
Well, largely it was because there'd been so much speculation beforehand. The small winners that you could take away from it was the really bad stuff that people kind of thought might happen that didn't. So a couple of things with capital gains tax. So there was this fear that it would be equalised with income tax, which it wasn't, and also that it would no longer reset on death. And that's a really big deal for people who are sitting on gains, waiting for them to reset on death. So that didn't come in, which was good. And also there were fears that that freeze on income tax, which has affected so many people, I think so many millions of people, there was a worry that that would be extended further into the future. Obviously, it's already done a lot of damage, but it hasn't been extended.
Absolutely, and it's the income tax rates thresholds that have been frozen since 2021-22 levels. So the figures that you can see highlighted in yellow are actually what those thresholds would be had they increased with inflation. So the effect of fiscal drag does mean that millions of people have been dragged into higher tax brackets and we're paying tax on a bigger proportion of our income. So really important that we exercise those annual tax allowances that we're going to come on to in more detail in the coming minutes. So Bradley, the rise in capital gains tax on investments, so stocks and shares, that could impact the everyday investor. But capital gains tax is a tax that with planning can be largely avoided. So what steps can people take to do that?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Claire. In lots of circumstances, it is a tax that can be avoided through planning. We've got a couple of months left before the end of the tax year, and there are some things that you can do before the tax year change, which would revolve around doing things like using your ISA allowance, using your pension allowance as well. But there are some other things you can do. So you can use your CGT exemption, so it's £3,000. But if you consider the timing of any sales, then what you can do is spread your gains across multiple tax years. So you could, for example, do some sales in March and then some more sales from the 6th of April. So it falls into the new tax year. If you are unfortunate enough to have losses, then you can consider offsetting some of these losses against any gains that you've got, and maybe that could be part of a wider portfolio review, which you might be undertaking at this kind of year anyway. And if you are married, then you can transfer assets between spouses, which will then transfer the gain between those spouses as well. And again, you can then take advantage of these spreading across tax years to use up exemptions in both years. So plenty of things that you can do.
So pensions and ISAs being the tax efficient wrappers, any investments held within those products, no capital gains tax to pay. So really emphasising the importance of those. Helen, one bit of good news was that pension tax-free cash was left untouched. There was a huge amount of speculation in the weeks and months leading up to the budget that it would be something that Labour would tinker with. But because of all of that speculation and all of those rumours, it did lead some people to act and take that money out of caution. What can those people do now?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Claire. I mean, the speculation around tax-free cash, it ran red hot for weeks and weeks ahead of the budget. People took fright, and some people decided to take their tax-free cash so they could kind of keep hold of it. Now, obviously, those changes didn't come to pass, but this has now left a lot of people with this lump of tax-free cash, and they may not know what to do with it. So, you could potentially reinvest it into a stocks and shares ISA, for instance, because then that means it still has the potential to benefit from investment growth. The other option, what a few people had said to me was, oh, well, I've taken it from my SIP, so I'll just put it straight back in. And you can understand why people would think that. But they need to be really, really careful that there are things called the pension recycling rules that are in place. And they were kind of put in place to stop people from, kind of taking tax-free cash, reinvesting it to get more tax relief on the contributions. And, if you are seen to have contravened those rules, then you can get a tax charge attached to that. And, if you're looking at the slides right now, there's a rundown of the rules there. All criteria must be met for a breach to be decided. But if there is a breach, as I say, there is kind of quite a sizable tax charge. So, if people are thinking of doing, looking to reinvest anything into this SIP, please do speak to a financial advisor, I would say, to make sure that you're not skirting around and potentially landing yourself with a tax charge that you could well do without.
Absolutely. So unfortunately not as simple as you've taken it out, you can pop it back in. Bradley, we do have you, a financial advisor, in the room. So what can those people do from a planning perspective if they have taken out that tax-free cash and they're looking at what their options are?
Yeah, I think it's important to come back to that word plan, and it's likely that anybody who had money in a pension which they then took out, it was probably part, in part for their retirement plan. It might have been some legacy planning. It was probably a bit of both that a lot of people were doing. And just because that money's been taken out of the pension as tax-free cash, it doesn't mean it still can't be part of your retirement strategy or your legacy strategy. And there are some things that you can do in the shorter term which are relatively easy to do. So the one that springs to mind immediately is to use your ISA. Particularly if you haven't used your allowance. If you're married, then you can do it across spouses. So that could be, let's say you took £100,000 out as tax-free cash, and now it's sat in your bank account and you're not sure what to do with it. Well, if you're married, then you can put £20,000 in for yourself, £20,000 in for your spouse, and as soon as the next tax year kicks in, you've got another £20,000 for both of you as well.
Yeah.
So immediately or not immediately, but over a couple of months, that could be £80,000 of this 100 back into a tax wrapper. For any money over and above that, then you could look at a general investment account like a fund and share account. It's not a tax wrapper, but it will come with certain concessions on a tax point of view, such as the £500 dividend allowance, the £3,000 CGT exemption as well. Plus, you can hold a fund and share account in joint names, so it doesn't have to be in individual names like an ISA. Putting money back into a pension you can do, but you have to be very careful, as Helen alluded to with the rules. You can make gifts with that money, so if legacy planning was part of the reason it was in the pension, of course that's going to change and we'll talk about that, but you can give this money away and get the 7-year clock ticking, or you could use some of your exemptions as well. And there's, I suppose, more of a niche area. If you're looking for an income and this money was there and perhaps you would have bought an annuity with it within the pension, but you took it out because you wanted the tax-free cash, you could consider a purchase life annuity. Very similar to a pension annuity, albeit it's using money from a non-pension product. It is a bit more complicated, so probably an area where advice is worthwhile. Plus you can speak to PensionWise as well. If you're over 50, you can get in touch with PensionWise, who can take you through your options.
Brilliant. We should say that PensionWise is a government service which is impartial, so anyone over the age of 50 can book an appointment with them and discuss all of the options at retirement just to really get that bigger picture before they make any choices. We are going to come back to inheritance tax planning and what we were talking about there in a few minutes, but I would like to just circle back to another topic that has been making waves in the media for quite some time, and I imagine sparking lots of debate at private school gates, which is that Labour have decided to add 20% VAT on school fees, which will lead to obvious cost increases as some of that is being passed on to parents. Bradley, what can parents do and what can they think about when it comes to the other financial implications as well as those rising costs in terms of their bigger plan?
Yeah, so I think the immediate and the obvious implication is that if you're spending more on school fees, that's less that you've got to save and invest for other plans, which are probably going to be your longer term retirement plans. And that could lead to those plans being impacted and you having to change them in certain ways. And it could be that you might have to delay your retirement, for example. Maybe you'll need to reduce your retirement goals. So if you've got a particular goal to spend X amount in retirement, maybe you need to revisit that. It could be that you need to look at risk. Maybe you need to take on a bit more risk to try and compensate for less that can go into your retirement plans. But then, of course, you have to bear in mind that taking on more risk involves taking on more risk, and that could work against you. So, again, this is an area where perhaps advice would be very useful. I think for somebody of working age, and I'd imagine most people who are putting children through private school are of working age, I think your biggest asset is your ability to earn. So you could perhaps lean on that more, see if you can earn more, generate more income, perhaps ask for a pay rise, whatever it may be, to take advantage of that asset that you've got.
Brilliant, lots of thoughts there. And I think probably another consideration is the impact of rising school fees and what that might mean for things like your emergency fund. So if you have set aside that essential expenses, usually 3 to 6 months worth, actually the impact of having children at private school, you might consider ensuring minimal disruption to their schooling as one of your essential expenses. So if so, actually, does that cash amount that you've set aside, does it still stretch to 3 to 6 months worth of essential expenditure should life throw you a curveball? So perhaps reviewing that sum and seeing whether it needs topping up.
I was just going to say one of the things that is sort of overlooked in this process sometimes is having conversations with the children themselves. So I think anyone who's sort of looked at the private school system, that the fees are just the start, and that there are huge numbers of extras on top, and then suddenly the bill, it can be just horrendous. I mean, you've seen the pictures of those lovely Scottish kilts, reminds me of the Scottish school I went to. But talking to children and saying to them, look, you know, maybe we won't send you on all this, you know, on the trip, or we won't, you know, we won't be able to go to after school clubs, or whatever compromises that the child might be perfectly willing to take in order to stay at the school. Just have those conversations. It can feel very difficult to have a conversation because you want to do the best by your children, but fundamentally it's putting the ball back in their court and they can make decisions about their own future too.
It's a really good point. As you say, it does typically mean more expensive school trips, more expensive school uniforms. It's the whole package. Helen, we're going to circle back to pensions. So it's very much a tale of two halves, isn't it? Big sigh of relief, no changes to pension tax relief or pension tax-free cash. However, on the other hand, there's now the possibility of pensions being brought in to the inheritance tax in the future. What do people need to know?
Okay, so I think the first thing that people need to know is that these changes, if they do come to pass, will come in 2027. So they're not a here and now kind of thing. However, I do think that we are going to see people start to put some preparations into place so that they're ready for them. So I think what we will see is more people look to start gifting now while they're alive as a means of reducing their estate for inheritance tax purposes, rather than gifting it once they've passed away. So just a few things to kind of recap, because there's a lot of misconceptions flying around inheritance tax. So inheritance tax is usually levied on estates worth more than £325,000. However, if you are married, or if you're passing on your main property to a child or a grandchild, for instance, your thresholds will be higher. So it's really important to know what your thresholds are. And, you know, it is kind of something that means that a lot of families will not have to worry about inheritance tax. So I think that's really, really important. I think currently, I think you might have said earlier, Sarah, 4% of estates pay inheritance tax. I mean, that will go up, but not, not massively. But for those people that do think they might have an inheritance tax liability, there are things that they can do. There's various kind of gifting allowances. So to start with, any gifts that you give will fall out of your estate for inheritance tax purposes after 7 years. So that's why I think we'll start to see people making plans now, because they want to get that 7-year clock ticking sooner rather than later. But then there are other gifting allowances too. So you can give £3,000 per year to people without it being added to your estates, and that can be given to one person, or it can be split across several people. Added to this, you can make gifts to loved ones who are getting married. So I think it's £5,000 to a child. If it's a grandchild, it's 2,500, I believe, and then anybody else, it's 1,000. So again, they will fall out of your estate straight away. You can also give as many gifts worth up to £250 as you want to per year, as long as you haven't used another allowance on one of those people. So there's various allowances. There's also another kind of lesser known rule that I think is going to be really, really important, and that's the whole gifting out of surplus income. And the idea for that is that you can make a gift of whatever size, and it will fall out of your estate immediately, as long as you can prove that A, those gifts are regular, and B, it hasn't affected your lifestyle as a result of making it. So you don't want to leave yourself struggling financially because you're trying to gift away a lot to try and mitigate an inheritance tax liability. So examples of regular gifting could be school fees. Things like that. And I do think that's going to be something that people are going to be looking at more closely. What I would say is that you have to keep very, very good records to show that these gifts are regular, that you haven't impacted your standard of living as a result, in case HMRC were to ask, any questions at any point.
Absolutely. So lots of different rules on gifting there. And appreciate that these rules are not going to be introduced until 2027, but it really does combine two areas of planning, retirement planning and estate planning, that are typically pretty complex. So Bradley, have you noticed that these are really hot topics with clients at the moment?
I think we're in the quiet before the storm at the moment. As you mentioned there, the changes to pensions and inheritance tax, with pensions being brought into your estate, it's not scheduled to come in until April 2027. So we've still got 2 years and 2 months until that change comes in, and in that time, pensions will still offer a shelter from inheritance tax. So I think there's definitely a risk of perhaps moving too quickly with this. I mean, since the budget, I've had conversations with every single one of the clients who I work with on a regular basis who are going to be impacted by this. And in each case, we've come to the conclusion that this is something that we need to be thinking about and something that we need to be aware of. But we don't necessarily need to do anything drastic now. It's something we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater by making a change now, which could end up having an adverse effect when we're trying to solve a problem, which isn't yet a problem. It's still got a couple of years until it does come in.
Okay, Sarah, in October, to add to that, it was announced that inheritance tax thresholds would be frozen until 2030. Is that going to impact a lot of people that are looking to pass on wealth? We've heard that the stats at the moment in terms of people paying inheritance tax are around 4%. Do we expect that to increase?
It is likely to increase, yes. I mean, it's worth bearing in mind that obviously before you become subject to inheritance tax, there's a huge number of different allowances that you can have access to. There are some people who are particularly vulnerable in these sorts of situations. So, one of the most used allowance is the passing to the spouse. So you can pass, obviously, everything inheritance tax free to your spouse. You're also, therefore, passing your sort of tax-free allowances as well. So on the second death, there's sort of up to £1 million worth of assets that you can give away tax-free. There are some people, though, lots and lots of people who aren't married and who don't have that extra kind of allowance and maybe don't have children and they have a much smaller allowance. And I think it's a lot of those people who might feel a little bit under pressure by it. Yeah. So we know also when you've got frozen allowances like this and you've had asset increases like we've had, so obviously there's been stock market performance, there's also been house prices increases, which is a really big part of it. And so it means that so far this year, so from April to October, the amount of inheritance tax being paid was up 11% on the same period a year earlier. So we know there's more tax that is being paid. I would say the really important thing is to not panic. I think probably a lot of the people that you're talking to about their inheritance tax planning, they're probably under some pressure from their family who know that this is a really great opportunity to get in there and say, oh, here, you might have an inheritance tax issue. I think there are lots of different emotional and financial pressures on people when they're making these sorts of plans. And it's really important not to kind of be forced into taking steps you're not happy with or take them faster than you're happy with, because no one is going to thank you if you get sort of further down the track and suddenly you're thinking, I don't have enough money, I'm going to have to ask for some of it back.
I think that's a really good point. It is also the emotional side of talking about inheritance tax, both for the people, I suppose, who are looking to leave their wealth, because thinking about our mortality is never a nice thing, but also for how people talking to the older generation can broach that conversation sensitively, which I imagine that you've got a bit of experience with, Bradley, in talking to your clients. But with receipts on the rise, we just heard they're up 11% on last year. How can people minimise inheritance tax? And I guess it's coming back to this having a plan over the longer term, so there's no knee-jerk kind of movements. What are the ways that people can do that?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that inheritance tax planning should come secondary to your own retirement planning and making sure that you've got sufficient assets for your own life and the lifestyle that you want. So sometimes I will get clients get in touch with me who are maybe late 50s, early 60s, asking about inheritance tax, probably because it's in the news, before they've retired or before they've got a retirement plan and they know what they're going to be spending in their own lives. And I always tend to say, let's just get that sorted first and then we can address inheritance tax. But in terms of things that you can do, it is a topic, and there are some really big things you can do, but also there are some much easier things that you can do which are much smaller. So I tend to break things down into two different categories when talking about inheritance tax solutions. The first category you see on screen here on the left is things which are much easier to do, but they're going to have a lower impact. These are the kind of things that you perhaps will get into a habit of doing. It's almost like chipping away at a problem over a long period of time. This can include things like using your gifting allowances. Helen went through those earlier on, including gifts out of surplus income. Spending more. Spending more is one which a lot of people don't realise is something which, of course, if you spend money, it's not there in your estate anymore. I tend to sort of jokingly suggest to clients that, if they book a holiday and they've got assets which are over the inheritance tax threshold, well, they're going to get a 40% discount on that holiday. Just make sure you're not spending money on things which then have a value, like property, for example. Pension contributions are still on there. I think it's worth pointing out that is still something which can be done over the next couple of years, putting money into a pension. But of course, from April 27, any money in a pension will be part of the estate. So, that one was perhaps not one which is going to bring any sort of real long-term benefit. And then on the right-hand side, we've got things which are much harder to do, but will have a much bigger impact. This is where I do a lot of my work with clients. This includes things like larger gifts, so gifts over and above your exemptions, so typically 5-figure, maybe even 6-figure gifts. That could involve the use of trusts where appropriate, whole of life insurance, I think we're gonna touch on later on, and business property relief. It's important to note that these types of solutions, they're more complicated, and this is where taking financial advice can really be invaluable. I think it's important when considering these more sort of complex solutions to ensure that you aren't creating or potentially creating a problem in the future by trying to solve a problem now. An example I've got here is if you were to give away a load of assets, it may be absolutely fine now, it may be fine for the next 15, 20 years, but if you suddenly go into a care home and you need access to liquid money, then you may have caused yourself a problem. I had a meeting with a client just last week where their mother's moved into a care home and they're paying £2,000 per week in care costs, £104,000 a year. Now, if you've given away all of your assets, particularly if you've got a spouse who's still alive and they're in the property, so you can't sell that property, it's going to cause a real problem. So, with advice, one of the things that we do to make sure that any decisions taken now are sound in the future is to use cash flow modelling and scenario testing, and we'll test out different scenarios such as care being required before deciding on the right course of action.
And ensuring that there is that buffer for flexibility or uncertainties. I think really drawing out what you said at the outset, which is that do consider your retirement before you start gifting money to ensure that you have enough money for your own financial freedom before you then pass it on to loved ones. So following on from that, in terms of those harder and higher impact steps, where do you see those key planning opportunities with those changes?
Yeah, so I think the changes in the budget, as I was watching the budget and the announcement came on the pensions, the sort of two things that immediately sprung to mind that I think will become more popular over the coming years. The first is annuities, both pension and non-pension annuities, and the second is whole of life insurance. I think with an annuity, I'm sure a lot of people will know what that is, but it's where you give up capital in exchange for a guaranteed income for the rest of your life. The capital that you give up, that immediately leaves your estate. If it's money inside of a pension, that's not quite the case now, but it will be in a couple of years. So it can offer an immediate inheritance tax saving. I mentioned purchase life annuities earlier on. Very similar to pension annuities, it's just you're buying them using non-pension money, so that will provide an immediate tax saving. And I've seen quite a lot of these products being set up since the budget in October, because it increases your guaranteed income, it reduces your market risk, but also now it's got an immediate inheritance tax saving as well. So I think annuities will become more popular, and I think whole of life insurance, which we've been using for a number of years for inheritance tax, but now that pensions have been brought into the estate, it's quite a nice solution for the right client, and I think it's going to become a bit more popular. For those who aren't perhaps aware of whole of life insurance, this is where you set up a life insurance policy. This is to pay out a lump sum on your death. If you're married, this would be on second death, because assets transfer to the surviving spouse on first death. And the idea is that payout is made into a trust, and that money is then used to pay the inheritance tax bill, rather than your estate having to sell property or assets to pay that bill. Of course, once you've set up that policy, you'll then have to pay monthly premiums for the rest of your life. So again, it's important that you consider the longer term impact of setting up a contract like this, and this is where advice can be useful when it comes to modelling out scenarios and making sure that if you do need care in the future, that you can still afford the premiums to pay for the whole of life contract. It is a more complex area, and certainly one of those where we'd suggest seeking advice.
Brilliant, thank you. Lots of insight there. So we are going to park the inheritance tax there, and we're going to move on to something that we haven't talked about in detail yet, and that is the increase in stamp duty surcharge for second homes or investment property. So it's risen from 3% to 5%. Stamp duty, of course, is calculated on the purchase price of the property. So we are talking thousands of pounds more to find in tax rather than hundreds of pounds. So if we take the average property price last year, it was around £300,000. So if we're looking at that increase in stamp duty surcharge on any second properties or investment properties, then you're looking to find around another £6,000 just in tax. And of course, there are lots of other expenses that go alongside buying a property. But we often hear that people use property as their retirement plan rather than prioritising a pension. I mean, my question is, does this strategy still add up? So Sarah, I'm going to come to you first and then pass over to our pensions expert, Helen.
Well, I think, the first thing to say is that a lot of people absolutely love property. And, especially in the UK, we are obsessed. And And therefore, trying to persuade some people who are very, very keen on property that it's not the right thing for them can be very hard. So that, having said that, it is incredibly untax efficient. So as you said, you pay extra stamp duty when you go in. You then, as you go along, you pay income tax on any rental income. And then, of course, rental income sort of adds on top of your other income. And then, therefore, lots more people are going over their those frozen income tax thresholds. Then, of course, you've got the capital gains tax that you pay when you sell up. So you're kind of paying going in, paying as you go along, and paying when you come out. And there's no way to mitigate it. So it's not like with stocks and shares where you can sort of realise gains as you go along, or put them in a stocks and shares ISA and not pay tax on them. There is just you are landed with this bill and there's very little you could do about it. I think also one of the things to bear in mind with property is that we get to know it as a homeowner and we think we understand it. And we do as a homeowner. But as an investment, it's very, very different. So if you think about investment sort of strategies, one of the absolute keys is diversification. And you can't get anything less diversified than a property. Basically, you're not just saying all my investments is going to be in this property, you're saying all of my leveraged investments is going to be the same as the investment that I've made in my own home. So it's incredibly focused, and especially if you buy something local to you because you think, it'll be really handy to manage, what you're doing there is focusing it all on the exact performance of property in the street or the town or whatever. So it is an incredibly risky thing to do, and it's really worth understanding that if you want to go into investing in property, it's a completely different beast to actually owning a home of your own.
And Helen?
Okay, so I'm going to start this by saying I am incredibly biased in favour of pensions, but I genuinely think that when it comes to retirement, there is no more tax efficient way to prepare for retirement than a pension. So for a start, you get tax relief at your marginal rate. You then get the potential for up to 25% tax-free on the way out. Then if you're a member of a workplace pension scheme, you get the employer contribution on top. So if you bring all of that together, that is incredibly compelling way to save for the long term. I think also, Sarah's highlighted some of the issues around, being a buy-to-let landlord, and I think the day-to-day reality of it is often very different to what people think. You've got all the extra charges that go along with maintaining a property. There could be periods of time when you've got no tenants and you've got to cover those costs. And I actually think that when it comes down to the costs and the time involved, people might find that the dream is very, very different to the reality.
And I do know someone who used to have a property that they rented out in Chelsea, and there was one year he came to me and said, I'm never renting out to royalty again. So it's not UK royalty, but his experience was that having to completely refurbish the flat, it was totally different to the maths that he'd gone into it with, because you just don't know what to expect when you're dealing with something like a property. Sorry, I'm being very down on property. There's lots of people who love it. There you go.
It's also a big time commitment, isn't it, if you were going to manage that and the maintenance yourself? Because if you want an agency to do that for you, then of course that comes with a cost and that eats into your profit. And we have got a full guide on our website because we could talk about this for the rest of the session, property versus pension. So you can download that for free and it goes into it in much more depth. But we can't due to the time constraints of this afternoon's session. So Sarah, we have covered quite a lot of ground today. So could you sum up kind of what the top no regrets moves are ahead of the 5th of April, which of course is the end of tax year?
Yes, I mean, there aren't any marmalade droppers here, so you will know all of the really sensible moves that you can make, but it is worth emphasising that you've got this window and it is worth taking advantage of. And we do know, we know from how many people still haven't filed their tax return for the end of January, we know people leave things to the last minute. So it's, you can pay into an ISA, so you've got your £20,000 limit. If you've already got existing investments, you can transfer them into an ISA using the Bed and ISA or share exchange programme. Then there's also your pension, so that's a really strong tax shelter of up to £60,000 depending on your income. And obviously you get your tax relief at your highest marginal rate, which is very, very important. And then there's the planning with a spouse, which is absolutely key, because we've talked about sort of being able to transfer assets between you and your spouse and then managing your tax bills that way, and that's a really important thing to do. If you do that before the end of the tax year, as we mentioned, you can then take advantage of those tax efficient vehicles before the end of the tax year.
Absolutely, and there are ways that you can actually move. You don't need new cash, do you, in terms of putting that into an ISA or a pension? You could actually share exchange. So you could move or bed an ISA and bed and SIP investments you've got outside of the tax efficient wrappers into them for future tax efficient growth. Just bear in mind that you need to consider any gains that you might have made in your capital gains tax allowance with that. So Bradley, we're now going to talk about the fact that actually quite often there might be financial change. We have a couple of fiscal events a year, and of course there could be further changes ahead. What are the recommendations for people really navigating their finances in times of change?
Yeah, so first I think it's worth acknowledging that it is difficult trying to build a plan and then rules change and you don't know if they're going to change in the future. I think most conversations I have with clients at some stage they'll say, what happens if I don't have tax-free cash available or so on. And I'd always say, well, we can only plan for what we know now and what we can do to try and help is build some flexibility into the plan. And I think in terms of flexibility, the key thing, everyone's heard the phrase cash is king. I think the key thing is having a cash reserve pot that just gives you a bit of flexibility to adjust to any changes and perhaps adapt a plan. And we've got a couple of rules of thumb when it comes to how much cash to hold. If you're still working and earning, we typically suggest around 3 to 6 months worth of your expenditure as an accessible cash fund. If you're in retirement, maybe 1 to 2 years worth of expenditure. In terms of what we deem cash, it would be cash in a current account, a savings account which isn't locked in some sort of fixed rate, premium bonds, essentially something you can get your hands on very, very quickly if needs be. One thing I think Sarah mentioned earlier on, that when fiscal changes do occur, there's often a time between the announcement and the actual implementation of those, during which you can kind of digest the change and speak to your advisor and see how it's going to impact you and make plans accordingly. And having that flexibility with cash is something that helps with that.
Brilliant, thank you. And then fittingly, our final question, Helen and Sarah, is, now we've talked about possible navigating any change, is actually what our predictions are for 2025. Do we think it will be 2020 thrive for finances?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously the beginning of this particular year, the calendar year, obviously obsessed with tax, it has been a pretty turbulent time. So we had all the sort of drama in the bond markets right at the beginning of the year. We've also had sort of quite an upset in the stock markets. It is worth saying that, if you take a look at what's happened in the bond markets, these things are short-term movements. So we saw big drama when there was sort of questions around, what's going to happen with inflation in future. But then they've really been dialed back. So a lot of the fears that people had about things like the impact on mortgages, for example, that's a really huge one for people who are just due to remortgage. Actually, a lot of that, it's not necessarily something to panic about. With mortgages, for example, you can secure a rate 6 months in advance. You can do that, and you've sort of effectively hedged your bets, because if rates get lower, then you can just look elsewhere and get one, and if they get higher, then you've already got one in the bank. So it's really important, I think, not to get carried away with what's happened so far. And to sort of look ahead and think that there's a long time till the end of the year, and there's a long time beyond the end of the year, so we don't need to necessarily worry so much. I would say, in the immediate future, we've got the spring statement. We're not expecting that to be a major announcement. It's not going to be anywhere near the drama that we had in the August, thank goodness me. And so I think a lot of what people will be dealing with is sort of the fallout from the autumn budget rather than anything else. Okay. I will also say that on the plus side, because I know obviously in our role we do sort of spread a lot of the bad news. But on the plus side, we've just done the HL Savings and Resilience Barometer, and I would really recommend, if you're interested in the barometer, it's loads on the website at the moment, and you can really delve into how everyone in your postcode is doing, for example. So it's really interesting stuff. But that overall says that our resilience in the coming year is likely to remain pretty robust, and we are likely to increase the amount of savings that we have. So from a financial resilience perspective, particularly in the short term, things are looking fairly positive.
And I know that the barometer is a data set that we refresh every 6 months, so that picture will continue to grow in the coming months. But one of the interesting things from that is that since the pandemic, actually, as a nation, our rainy day savings, that's grown considerably, so we are better protected. We've built up a buffer for when life throws us a curveball, so that's a real positive. Helen, coming to you.
Okay, so in terms of what I'm expecting from 2025, I think the rumour mill will continue to churn, if I'm being honest. Obviously we've just recovered from all those rumours around tax-free cash. We've barely recovered from that, and the next set of rumours have started. So the thing that's coming across my desk more and more is stuff around the state pension, for instance. So I was on radio a week or so ago talking about the opportunity to buy national insurance contributions, to peg up your state pension, and I got a lot of responses back saying, oh, well, what's the point of me doing that if it's only going to become means tested? So it just shows kind of how damaging speculation rumours can be. And I think going back to what Bradley said earlier on, what I would encourage people to do is to work within the system that we are currently in, try not to get too kind of deflated by rumours and speculation. The government is carrying out a pensions review at the moment. This is going to be ongoing for some time. And what I'm really hoping is that this is going to really kind of look at delivering real certainty to people to help them plan long term without fear of being tripped up by tax changes coming down the line. We've seen so many changes to annual allowances and stuff like that, and that can really undermine people's confidence. The next phase of the review is going to be focusing on adequacy, and this is really, really important because you mentioned there about HL savings and resilience barometer, and while it is true that our kind of rainy day savings have grown, our retirement resilience has eroded. There's only 36% of households on track for a moderate retirement income at the moment. So it's really clear that there's so much more that needs to be done to get our retirement planning back on track. A final thing I'm going to say is, if pensions is my favourite subject, annuities is probably my second favourite subject, and Bradley mentioned it earlier. I think they're going to continue to be really big news in 2025. Annuities were a bit unloved for many years. We had a low interest rate environment. It really pushed down the incomes available, and people just didn't think that they were that great value for money. However, what we've seen recently, rising interest rates, the bond market dramas that we've seen recently, that all means that annuities are delivering some really, really good incomes right now. Last year was a bumper year for the market, and I would expect 2025 to be very much in the same vein.
Lots of food for thought there. So for anyone who is kind of considering their finances holistically and of course reviewing their plan, we've heard the importance of planning today a few times. It might be the buzzword of today's session. We are offering people the opportunity to book a post-budget clinic with either Bradley or one of his financial advisor colleagues. Really the opportunity to talk through your current plan, work out actually perhaps whether you have a need for advice. Bradley, can you just shed some light on what that appointment might look like and what the triggers for advice might be?
Yeah, so the triggers can be anything and everything really. I think the main one, particularly in the work that I do, is someone getting in touch because of a change in personal circumstances, the most common of which is retirement. What bigger change can there be than working all your life to waking up and never having to work again? That's probably the most common one, and particularly retirement, but any sort of change in your financial circumstances can be particularly daunting, and advice can offer you the peace of mind that you are doing the right things, you're not going to fall foul of rule changes or anything like that. And if you are going to be doing something like a big inheritance tax move like the ones we looked at earlier, that you are scenario testing and making sure that you're not going to cause other problems by trying to solve this one. So what we offer is a chance to speak to a financial advisor completely free of charge to see whether or not advice is something that you could benefit from. If so, what that might look like and what any costs might be. So you can have that initial chat completely free of charge. So you've got nothing to lose.
And you can book that by scanning the QR code on screen with your phone, and that will take you through to the appointment booking form, and then one of the financial advice team will be back in contact. They are free appointments, so to do book one of those. So there will be some important investment notes on screen. If you wouldn't mind taking a minute or two to read through those, they just reiterate that everything that we've discussed is information and not to be considered financial advice. Thank you very much for tuning in, and hope to see you at a future session. And thank you very much to all of my colleagues who've joined me in the studio, to Sarah, to Helen and to Bradley. Thank you.